Okay, recording's going. This is November 10th, Thursday, and our assignment tonight is assignment L, which is work sharing. I want to start out by talking a little bit about backups and how they work in a non-work shared environment, which is where we've been so far, and then how that changes when you go into a work shared environment. First of all, I want to kind of define the word. I have two handouts here that are open. There's a handout called Work Sets, and it starts with a bunch of definitions. So I want to start by defining the term work shared and work sets. Okay, work sharing is the Revit process that allows you to have several people working together on the same project. And if you think about it in AutoCAD, when you have a project, you have a lot of separate DWG files, different drawings, and so typically you can't really have two people open the first floor plan at the same time in AutoCAD because they're physically trying to open the same file. Now, AutoCAD has a partial open function, but very few people use it because it's messy and it's hard to really work with. So the fact that Revit has your entire project in one file would seem to make that even more difficult because you can't literally have two people open the same physical file at the same time. And so how would you have two people, three people, four people work on the same project? So the process of enabling that functionality is work sharing, and so you have to turn on work sharing to be able to do that. And I'll show you how to turn it on. In order to turn on work sharing, you start the process and it creates containers called work sets. So a work set in some respects is similar to a layer in AutoCAD in that it can contain some of your Revit elements of your project. And the way Revit sets up work sets, there are several different kind of subheadings, kinds of work sets. There are user created, and then there's project standards, families, and views, which are the three other kinds of work sets. But the most important one is the user created. And that means, kind of like you can create your own layer in AutoCAD, you can create a work set in Revit, and you can collect things and put them into that work set. And to put them in the work set, you just change their properties. Or you set that work set active, kind of like you would set the current layer in AutoCAD, and then when you draw lines, it goes into that current layer. But to change it, you just select the walls that you want to move to the other work set, and you go into the wall properties and say, okay, I want that to go into this work set. None of that can happen, though, until you enable work sharing. So I'm going to talk about how to enable it. But I want to back up for a minute about how backups work prior to enabling work sharing. And so I'm going to pull up an early handout that we talked about weeks ago, and that is how backup files work in Revit before work sharing is enabled, and that's what I had right there, before work sharing is enabled. So you get your house A, is a simplified name. That's always the copy that's your latest, greatest, just got saved file. And then all the second most, third most, fourth most recent files are the ones that have the .000 number after them. So theoretically, you could save it 9,999 times, and you would have all of those backups. But when Revit opens up a file for you, it assumes you're only going to keep 3 copies of your backups. So unlike AutoCAD, where you have a .back file, and that's all you can go to unless you crash, and then there's that autosave file somewhere, Revit always saves at least 3 copies unless you change that number. And how you would go about changing that number of backups, again, before work sharing is enabled, is you pretend you're going to save the file under another name. You can't just hit the save button because then it saves it. And if I go into, let me just show you my folder here. So the file that I have open right now is my house K. Let me go ahead and save it. And I'm going to call it house L for right now. So when I go into the Save As dialog, whether I've already saved it under this name or not, I go in here again and I hit Options. And at the top here it says Maximum Backups, and it defaults to 3. And I was talking earlier tonight about how I'm working on a project at home at my office, and I'm wanting to remember how many hours I've spent on it, and I don't always go in and fill out my timesheet. So I bump up my maximum number of backups to a bigger number, 12, 20, something like that. And that way, every time I save, it will keep up to 12 of them, and then when I get to the 13th backup, the first one gets deleted. Get to the 14th, the second one gets deleted. So that explains why, if you look at this, I have a 5, 6, and 7 of K. I have a 1, 2, and 3 of G because I didn't save more than 4 times. And so those numbers, it's going to keep the 3 most recent numbered backups, unless I go in and change this number. And then I could make it 12, so then I would never have more than 12 backups of my file. Problem with doing this is, right now these files are 17 megabytes. So if I set it to have, like 20, that's 340 megabytes worth of files backed up and current. And it really starts to fill up your hard drive pretty fast. So that's one kind of offshoot benefit of enabling work sharing, is that you no longer have all these numbered backup copies. Once you start work sharing, what Revit does is it makes a folder, and it keeps a bunch of gobbledygook information in that folder that don't take up near the amount of space that your whole Revit file does. So it's a much leaner way of storing information about how often you've backed up and when you backed it up and what changes you've made since then. And it all happens automatically, and then you can go back and look at the backups, which I'll show you how to do before we finish tonight. Let's go back to the handout with the definitions again. There's a work sets dialog that we're going to use in Revit. And let's see, this is 2010. They didn't really change it in 2011 much. It's going to look the same. And right now I don't have work sets enabled yet, but here right down at the bottom, I don't know if you all can see that from the back of the room. Let me shrink my Revit window so you can see it further back. This little, it looks like a blue cube and a wrench and a, who knows what else that is. So in the handout, it looked pretty much the same in 2010. It says work sets. So if I go to the ribbon that says collaborate, that's where the work sets button is. And this whole panel right here gets me into work sets. Now the first time I enable work sharing, I have to hit that button because right now there's nothing on that pick list. Once I hit it, I get this stern message that says, you are about to enable work sharing. And it gives you a warning. It says, sharing a project cannot be undone and requires careful planning and management. Click OK to enable work sharing, or cancel to return your project without enabling it. So in other words, if you don't know what you're doing, don't run past this stop sign because it cannot be undone. Well, in 2012, it can be undone. So this message doesn't get quite as scary. And really, once you've gone through this exercise with me tonight, you'll understand enough about work sharing that you'll be able to do it. But normally your file, once it's been work shared, you can't go back and make it normal again until you get into version 12. So I'm not going to do it yet. I'm just going to talk a little bit more here.
Okay, how did you activate your little...
That dialogue?
Well, you press collaborate. How did you activate that little logo all the way that one?
Yeah.
How did you activate that?
Well, if you hit collaborate, it should be there on the left. Okay.
Mine's grayed out. What did I do wrong?
Let me take a look here. Are you in a schedule or a view?
I'm in a view.
Okay. I go into the 3D view like that and you just see the difference. It shouldn't be the difference.
Far from them. That's out too.
Yeah. Oh, that's strange. Oh, you got an ad message on here. Oh, maybe that's not the way you read it. Let me see that through. If Revit's in the middle of doing something else, it may not. Go ahead and click on here and try spinning your view around, just make sure it's not.
Yeah.
Okay.
Again?
No. All right, look at the different side of That's strange. Yeah, I don't like you tonight. Richie's having a problem. We'll have to get to the bottom of why his work sets. Is everybody else who has Revit open? Do you get that colored in button there? Okay. It just doesn't like you, Richie. What did you say to make it mad tonight?
Do I right click or left click that collaborate tab?
Just left click and it should show what's on there. It has like the synchronize with central. Okay. Just wake it up. Sometimes clicking around will wake these things up. Sometimes the ribbons just kind of get stuck in a funk and when you fiddle around. Okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to divide up into groups, and one person of each group is going to be the one who enables work sharing and sets everything up. And then the others are going to jump in and make a copy of the file. So before we do that, I want to go over this other handout here, and I'm going to talk about the concept of work sharing. Now, I was thinking on the way here that what I need to do is put together a little PowerPoint that will demonstrate this, because I normally write it on the board, but when I do that, it doesn't show up on the recording. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to try to play this out, a scenario, and just point to things on this diagram. And so what we've got, when you work share a project, you're not physically all opening the same file, because that's kind of just doesn't work that way in Windows. What you're doing instead is you all have a duplicate of the central file. So the central file becomes the master copy of your project. And that's on the server in your office, or here it's going to be on the network on campus. And then on your local machine, you're going to have a local file that starts out as an exact duplicate of the main central file. Then once you start to work, let's say Ann adds some furniture, and let's say Ben puts in some doors. After you've done some changes, now your local copy is no longer matching the central copy. So then you have to go back and do what's called synchronizing. And this handout was still calling it Save to Central, STC. They've changed the term now to Synchronize. So that's a piece of text I need to update in there. But a synchronize goes both directions. It says, okay, anything that, in this case, this is Lou Kahn, or whoever, he has added some stuff. When he synchronizes, it takes his new elements and publishes them back to the central file, but it also takes anything else that's been published since he last synchronized and pulls it down to his copy. So after he does that, he has an exact duplicate of what's in the central file. Now let's say in the same time, Tom Jefferson and Zaha Hadid have been working in their copies. This is an all-star team here. So Lou and Tom and Zaha have all been working in different parts of the building. So, and what I'm going to do is kind of do a color-coded PowerPoint one of these days that shows this. So let's pretend Lou has put in walls, Tom has put in some doors on the exterior that was already there, and Zaha's putting in some cabinetry. Yeah, some wild angular cabinetry and curves and everything. So if Lou is the first one to synchronize, his walls get published back to the central file. But now the central file doesn't know what Zaha and Tom have been doing, and neither does Lou. So then, let's say Tom is the second person to synchronize, and his doors get published back into the central file, and what Lou had already published or synchronized comes back down to Tom. So now he has Tom's new walls, or Lou's new walls, and he obviously has his own new exterior doors as well. And Zaha's out in the cold. All she has is her new stuff. So then once she synchronizes, she'll synchronize, and then she gets a copy of what the other two had already synced back to the central file, and her stuff gets synced back as well. So now the central file finally has everybody's updates, but the only person who's up to date with the central file is the last one to synchronize, which in this case is Zaha. And since she was last, she's good now. And Tom and Lou can do what's called a reload latest, which is a one-directional pulling down of the changes. And if they do that, then all three of them have everything, and they're fully synchronized with the central file back to where they started. So the best way to do this, if you really have three people who are simultaneously adding stuff in different places in the building, is say, okay, we're ready to take a lunch break, everybody's going to take lunch, everybody synchronize. And if two people try to synchronize at the exact same time, it's going to tell one of them, sorry, the file is busy, and it's going to wait its turn until Tom's sync is done, and then Zaha's sync will kick right in. So once they've all synchronized once, then, the best way to do it from there is to have everybody reload latest, and then everybody has everybody else's changes. And then you're ready to take a lunch break, and everything is safe. So the central file is actually doing a couple of functions here. The first function it does is it maintains a record of the most up-to-date information, assuming everybody has synchronized. So it becomes the master copy. It's kind of like the bank that stores all the deposits and the changes and everything. But the second thing the central file does is it prevents, or I don't know if it's so much it does it, but Revit uses the central file and the work sets to make sure that no two people try to grab the same element at the same time. So let's say Lou adds a wall in the middle of the living room, and Tom wants to put a door, but he doesn't even see that wall, so he obviously can't put a door in that wall. Well, let's reverse it, and let's say Lou wants to delete the front exterior wall, and Tom has already started to put a door in that wall. Well, until Tom synchronizes and the central file says, okay, now there's a door in that wall, Lou isn't going to be allowed to delete that wall because it's already been checked out. When you place a door in a wall, you're controlling the new door you're placing, but you're also modifying the wall that's already in the database. And once this central file, which kind of acts like a traffic cop, says, wait a minute, somebody, or a librarian in a way, it's like, okay, somebody's already checked out that wall. They're doing something that relates to it. Lou, you can't touch that wall until Tom synchronizes and lets go of his control of it. So what 2011 doesn't do on its own is it doesn't notify Tom that, or Lou, that Tom has added a door into that wall. There's a separate add-on to Revit that's been around for a couple versions. It's called the Worksharing Monitor. And I'm not sure if I have that mentioned in the handout, but the Worksharing Monitor is a separate utility that will basically give a pop-up to somebody saying somebody's requested a change. So without that, in 29, 10, and 11, if you haven't installed and don't have that running, it's a separate little program that runs in your taskbar. Without that, if, what was I saying? Lou wanted to delete that wall, but Tom had already put a door in it. Then Lou has to call Tom up and say, Tom, I was trying to do something with that wall, and it says you control it. Can you synchronize and let go of control so I can come in and stretch the wall or do whatever I was going to do? And if Tom says okay, then he synchronizes, and then Lou reloads latest, so he has the update that includes the door. Then Lou is free to go ahead and stretch that wall or do whatever he was going to do with it. I mean, obviously, Tom wouldn't say, I put a door in it, so now you can go ahead and delete it, because that doesn't make sense. But in a scenario that makes sense, they need to communicate. That's the key, is communicating. Now, in 2011's Worksharing Monitor and in 2012, built into Revit, it will actually send a message to the other guy saying, someone else is trying to modify that wall that you control. And you can either say, okay, I grant permission because I haven't changed it, and then they get to check it out and borrow it, change it, and then synchronize. But in the case of when I've modified it and I haven't synchronized, I'm going to have to sync first, and then they'll get a pop-up saying, okay, that wall has been changed, now you can get it and do something with it. But where it gets a little messier is, what was I going to say? Okay, not as messy. Let's say you've used work sets and you've decided, I want to separate the interior part of the building and the shell of the building into two separate work sets. So in that sense, maybe Tom is working on the shell, the outside exterior walls and doors and windows, and Lou is working on the interiors. What they can do with those user-created work sets, a shell and an interior, is one can check out one work set and the other can check out the other work set. And let's say then Zaha is working on casework, which has its own work set. Then these two guys will control everything in that work set. So that way, if Tom is doing the shell, Lou cannot modify a wall, even if Tom hasn't touched it, but Tom has checked it out. So it's kind of like taking a whole stack of books and checking them out from the library. If you decide to open one of the books, you can, but nobody else can get to them because you have them at home. It's the same way with a user-created work set. And you can use that to your advantage because let's say, Tom went to the meeting where they were talking about the facade of the building, so he's the only one that really knows what needs to happen. For that reason, he might want to check it out. Otherwise, you don't have to check anything out. And anybody who grabs a piece of something that nobody else has happened to grab, it'll let them do whatever they want to do with it. And that's called borrowing. When you just go grab a wall and say, I'm going to move that wall over, you've borrowed the individual. There's a tiny little work set that contains each individual element. So as you touch a wall and you say, move it from here to here, you've borrowed the mini work set of just that wall. And until you finish your move and synchronize and bank it back into the central file, nobody else can touch that wall because Revit keeps track of each individual piece. It's like a huge database, which is what Revit is, and it's keeping track of every little thing that's been touched. So it's very sophisticated, and you would think, okay, I'm going to get into a mess here because somebody's going to do something and I'm not going to know what they've done and we're going to bump heads. surprisingly, that just doesn't happen very often. And when it does, we'll learn the protocol to see, okay, who's got it? What do? I talk to them and say, can you give it up? It's called relinquishing control. And so you make something editable, you're checking it out for the bank. Whether it's just one individual wall that you want to check out so nobody can touch that wall, or it's the entire shell user-created work set that you've put all those walls into. Any questions so far?
Yeah, I do.
Mm-hmm.
What I'm seeing there is as if you were within your own office, okay?
Uh-huh.
What I'm hearing and so forth, and I understand the concept.
Right.
Now, the next concept is, you got this one, you got a structural engineer,
Mm-hmm.
in a completely different office.
Maybe in town or maybe out of state or something.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
But he too, in his office, may have multiple different ones.
Yeah.
I'll do that, you're gonna have two central files.
Mm-hmm. That's a good question.
Is that, as it works in the central file within your local one there, does that work the same way between the two central files?
Just in case anybody didn't catch it on the recording, Corey's question is what happens when you've got an engineer in another office, maybe in another city, and he's doing structural, maybe mechanical, and you're doing the architectural. Can you communicate back and forth so that you've either got one central file or a central file in each location? Well, up until 2 or 3 versions ago, you couldn't communicate like that. For one thing, bandwidth just wasn't fast enough, and there wasn't a vehicle to do that. But a few versions ago, Revit came out with something called Revit Server, and that's designed to communicate between separate locations. And until bandwidth gets so fast that everybody can simultaneously, almost instantly make a change to something in New York from St. Louis, the Revit Server kind of makes that connection between offices. So what happens with Revit Server, and I don't have a diagram of it here, but I'm going to have to put that together because it's an important concept. You'll have a central file in each office, and then somebody, one of the offices says, I've got the master central file.
So you would still always have one master central file.
Right, and then you'd have, each office would have a local copy of that. Now, in practice, without Revit Server, what happens is the structural engineer works in his file, he gets a copy from the architect, and he builds on top of it in a linked file. And then once he's built the structure, he sends a copy of that by email or by FTP, because it's probably too big to email. And then the architect will download the structural model from the FTP site. He'll link it into his architectural model. And so you still exchange kind of at discrete points in time, like every Friday, and then they pull in the link. The advantage of that is that, as an engineer, when the architect is busy moving walls around and you just want to get a design for your ductwork, you'd rather have him kind of stop moving things so you can get a static design and then finish it and say, okay, now that he's moved stuff, I'll modify my design. With Revit Server and a continual link, you don't have that kind of cutoff point. And in the old days when we did sepias, some of you probably have never heard of a sepia, but it was like a Mylar drawing that photographically you would produce at the print shop. And it was kind of this dark reddish brown color. And you had a copy from the architect, and you're the engineer, you could draft right on top of that sepia. And if you had to change it, you had to turn this sheet over and use this eradicator to dissolve the red ink, and it's really messy. But the advantage of that is the architect would say, okay, we're at the end of schematic design. I'm going to make sepias of all my plans, give them to the engineer, and then he drafts on top of that. And while I'm changing my originals, he has a fixed copy of what I gave him. So in a way, in the old model of Revit before Revit Server, there are advantages to that, but I also know there are firms that are working in this way. And I'll give you an example. There's one firm in town that's a multidisciplinary firm that had MEP and architecture in the same office, and so they decided they would work in the same Revit file, and some of them opened that file in Revit architecture and some opened it in Revit MEP. So they had one central file for their office and local files for each user, and some users were using one flavor of Revit and some were using the other, which is fine. I could open a file that a Revit MEP program made, I just can't create ductwork. I can see them, I can create walls, he can create ductwork. And unfortunately for the architects, an engineer can create almost everything in Revit MEP, except maybe for ramps or certain odd things. Whereas an architect cannot create ductwork, he can't create a supplier return system like an engineer can. So what this firm decided to do is a lot of them worked in Revit MEP just so they could do whatever they wanted to, and they were syncing to one file. So the engineers and the architects had to keep pace with each other. So it was a coordination challenge, but they liked it because then they had one coordinated model at any given point in time that worked together as a building.
What is more advantage, aside from the fact of having the internet aspect of sharing the bitmap and feed and so forth?
Mhm.
Is it better to have it that way, or like what my office do with a client, every Friday we get updated drawings from the architect,
Mhm.
and then you get surprised, oh, you change everything.
Right, yeah, and then you have to go back and track it. Well, Revit has another feature that we won't really have time to get into, but I'll just describe it to you. What you'll do is you'll link, if I'm the architect, I'll link the MEP file that he sent me in, and I'll link the structural file. And I'll give you an example. Let's say the structural engineer has moved to column grid because he needs to shorten the span of something. And he's got a copy of column grids in his linked file that links into my Revit, kind of like an XREF. And I have column grids in my file. What Revit will do is it'll do a coordination review to tell me you need to look at the changes, and when you do, it says column grid 1 in the structural file has moved. Do you want to move yours in response to that so they match, or do you want to accept the difference between the two, or do you want to reject it? Keep what you've got, and that way when you send your file back to him, he gets a notice that you rejected that change, and he knows to move the column grid back to where it was. So that's a functionality in Revit that helps you know what's changed, so you're not just having to look through pins and needles, or a needle in a haystack to try to find what the architect has changed on you, or vice versa. So that's a good function, but it won't do it with everything. It'll only do it with column grids, levels, walls, and mechanical devices. You can't, and floors. So you can't copy monitor windows or light fixtures or certain things. And light fixtures would be one that would be really helpful because you've got the electrical engineer placing light fixtures and circuiting them, and you've got the architect who's designing the space and placing the light fixtures. And so the ability to copy monitor those elements would be nice, but I don't think that's done yet in 2012. I was just looking at that the other day. Any other questions?
Yeah, I have one.
Yeah.
If, for example, I don't know, one, if I do not reload latest, but I my file modifications I did,
Mm-hmm.
then I load that. Does it probably update both files and I get latest version again?
Whenever you synchronize, it goes two directions.
Okay.
So anything you've added gets synced back into the central file, and anything that's been already synchronized with the central file gets pulled back to you. So a synchronize is the best way to communicate with the central file and get everything pushed both directions. You just have to know who's done it the last time, and so if you've synced, but somebody else has been, let's say Corey's been working for an hour and he hasn't synchronized, which is probably too long, you want to set it to be more often than that, then you're not going to see everything he's been doing, but you'll see what other people have done if they synchronized before you. So the key is knowing that everybody has synchronized so that you got everything. Now, if he's gone in and he has placed light fixtures in a ceiling and he's cut holes in the ceiling, and then you try to go in and modify that ceiling, if he hasn't synchronized, he still maintains control of that ceiling, and so if you want to add a soffit and shorten the length of the ceiling, you can't do it, and you'll get a message that he owns that ceiling. So then you have to kind of synchronize and coordinate with each other. So it will tell you who owns it, and in 2012, it'll tell him that you're requesting. Otherwise, you have to go in and look for the little request button and say, okay, has anybody asked for something? And if you don't call him, he just has to know to go in and check that. So, you intercom him or you yell across the room and then he checks it and says, I'm going to grant permission.
What is the best practice to do reload or synchronize? How often?
It's easier just to say synchronize, and that way you get everything. But if you know that you haven't worked any on it, let's say, you've been doing something else at your desk for the last hour, and you synced before you went on to do other things, and other people have synchronized, then if you want to see what they've done, then you can reload latest, because you know there's nothing new that you have to give back to it.
How often should the synchronize be done or the reload?
Well, I would do the synchronize at least every half an hour, if not more, because one of the things that central file does is it makes sure that you've got a saved copy of everything. You know, let's say your machine crashes, your local file might get corrupted, but everything you synchronized is back in the server, which is a more reliable machine and everything. Now, let's say there's a lightning storm and zaps the power, and you're working from a laptop. If the power goes out, you've got a battery, and so you've still got your local file. And let's say your IT person wasn't smart enough to put a power backup, you know, an uninterrupted power system on your server. He's fired. But in the meantime, you've lost your central file. But because you're on a laptop and you synchronized pretty recently before the lightning struck, you have a local copy that represents pretty much everything. And so you can turn around once he gets the server turned back on and working again and say, okay, I'm going to take my local and I'm going to save over the top of the central file and make this the new central file. And I'll show you how to do that. There's a button you punch in there to say replace the central file, make this a new central. And that way everybody makes a new local and you start running from there again. So, yeah. Oh, it's already 8:30, isn't it? Yeah, let's take a break. I'll go ahead and burn this recording here. And this will be assignment